we look at Genesis 1, we think about God creating humanity, and he created us to create in some sort of way. And being creative is not just for artists. We all create in some form or fashion. So whether you're a teacher, a stay-at-home parent, an engineer, artist, et cetera, a politician, you create something. You are reaching for results. And so this book is, how can we walk through this book and communicate the different ways in which people have used their creativity for good or for detriment? Mm-hmm. And so I try to capture that through story. How do we use story as a means to shape identity and culture? How do we use work and vocation as a way to do that? How has justice and the fight for justice done that? How have people disagreed in their forms of creating and cultivating and yet still seem to be harmonious or, charitable? How has, within the particular subgenre of Christian culture, or Christian music and Christian hip hop, how has what are some things that need to be done in order for us to create good economic status, or economic elevation, social status, better education, just better platforms for folks who are on the margins? How can we create better art as Christians and not censor art and creativity? And then the last chapter is basically an assessment of how we can be better creators and cultivators on a daily basis. However, what some people may not know is that there are fiction pieces within the book. So between particular chapters, there are short stories and poems that I wrote.
So for this particular audience that'll be reading this, listening to this podcast, reading us on Relevant, where do you see these communities going wrong and how they create and what you're talking about here? What are some of the frequent missteps that you've observed?
Yeah, in the book, I detail a few, like I said, like in story and in the fight of the view of what justice is. I think the misstep is oftentimes is that when you are when you control narratives, you often don't know how the stories you form affect and impact other people. And so what I challenge us to do is to consistently castigate our work. Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians, I think, where he says to continue to evaluate yourself and your salvation to make sure, you're in right standing with the Lord. And I think there are often times, and I use this a quick example. They made me take most of it out the book, but you think about a pimp and a prostitute. Everybody, most Christians, better yet, will see that the work of a pimp is demoralizing and is degrading, not only to the prostitute, but to himself. And we see that as a vocation that is unhealthy. And most Christians would say you need to find different work. And we would ask that sister to stop selling her body and try to help liberate her, give her a better job, put her on a trajectory towards, as we would say, probably a more dignifying work. And I would say rightfully so. However, I also talk about in the book how somebody who does payday lending could walk into a church and we wouldn't bat an eye on that because they seem to have their life together. They manage their money well. Not only will we not challenge their work and their vocation, we would probably give them some sort of role and responsibility in the church, some sort of eldership. When payday loans destroy communities where you're taking advantage of people. It may be legal in many states, but yet and still, it's clearly a means that creates poverty. It creates a cycle of poverty in a lot of communities. And you target people who are in some dire needs. And so that's a way of evaluating how you may think your work is good, but how you may be creating towards the detriment of a society.
So you're talking about just a not just because it's a very big deal, but broader, more systemic understanding or interrogation maybe of what is good and what are these people actually creating with their work.
Yes, and that good is not always fixed. I talk about heroes and villains, and oftentimes we look at heroes and villains and we see them as caricatures, like in cartoons. Like evil is always easily identifiable. But in the real world, that's not the case. You know, sometimes evil is very enticing, it's very tempting. And oftentimes heroes can become villains and villains can become heroes. I talk about Tony Stark, one of my favorite. I love Iron Man. I love Marvel Comics. I love the MCU. But one of the interesting things about Tony Stark is Tony Stark is Iron Man. Iron Man is a superhero who flies over the world. But ultimately, Iron Man is solving all the problems that Tony Stark creates. You know what I'm saying? And I say, like, at the end of the day, Christians often get on planes and go save the world doing missions work. But they just did better work. If we had a better view of theology of work, then we wouldn't have to get on planes. You know, we wouldn't cause as much problems with our hammer and with our calculators and with our spreadsheets, because we're viewing our vocational output and our dispositions with great fear and trembling, and we're always asking, is what I'm doing good?